Hello, hello, and welcome once again to the David Messiah YouTube channel, where our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. And my name is Sidney Thomas. I'm the founder and the moderator of this channel. The title of this talk is Proving Negro Identity, or rather, Proving Negro Israelite Identity. And I'm sort of guided to address this subject arising out of a recent interchange I had with a brother who emailed me and had various kinds of questions. In the course of that email exchange, I was kind of led to giving a very sort of summative overview of how one goes about proving that the Negro indeed is Israelite. And if the Negro, then so also the Bantu people of Africa, and indeed the Congo Bantu people of Africa. Now there are two, so what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to give a very sort of quick, may not be all that quick, but at the very least, it's an overview kind of presentation in terms of how structurally one goes about proving the question at issue. How to prove that the Negro is Israelite. That's essentially the question. And to do it in a sort of a short, sharp way that, it can hang together. Sort of like if you could do it on a page, if it were written down. So that the structure of the proof should be very clear and very evident as to how one does it. And I address that actually in chapter 2 of this book here, which is the book, The Appointed Time, this one here, The Appointed Time, The Tarrying and His Faith, or The Testament of the Suffering Servant, issued under my Israelite spiritual name, Malachi Yahya Ben Yamin. And this chapter 2 does give a sort of a summative overview of that question of the proof of Israelite Negro identity. So let me now go straight away to that question, answering that question. There are two aspects to it, and one of them is not here present in this chapter 2, which is entitled "The Negro is Israelite," and so is seized with exactly the question we were addressing, which is how do you prove that the Negro is Israelite? And the first aspect of that only became apparent to me, really, when I did the second book, The Coming of David Messiah, because what arises out of the linguistic kind of issues that I addressed in that second book, restoring unto the people a pure language, using the pictographic sort of aspect of the Israelite Hebrew language, what came out of that was that we could sort of work out the original meanings of words exactly such as Negro. And when we did that for the word Negro, what we came up with essentially is that the word Negro in its original Hebrew meaning tautologically is saying you are Israelite. Negro means Israelite. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. Because the word Negro in that original sort of linguistic sort of meaning, once we restore that pure language, go back to the paleo-Hebrew consonants and the pictographic representations of those, what we came up with was that the word Negro means the people who are of the same root, tribal root, as the NEGA. And the word NEGA was a praise title that was used for King David. And its literal meaning was that son who is watched over and implicitly or impliedly by the Most High, that beloved one, the apple of God's eye. That's what that praise title NEGA means. So when you said NEGA, you meant David. And if you meant David, you meant the king. So even the very word NEGA came to mean king. And that is why in the Kebra, sorry, in the Ethiopic Hebrew, the Chronicles of the Kings, the word that they use for that, or the phrase used for that, is the Kebra Negast, where that second word Negas is just a pluralization of Nega, okay, and it means the kings, the Chronicles of the Kings, okay. And I'm not going to go over that because I addressed it, fairly sort of very much at some length in this book here, The Coming of David, Messiah. Yes, in this chapter here, chapter 2, I was going to chapter 3, but anyway, here in chapter 2, talk about Negro Judah in Babylon. Yes, it was Negro, and cognates. Yeah, so the words Negro, and their variants are in fact Hebrew in origin and linked to David and his throne. That their Hebrew etymology and denotative meanings are noble. And see that the noble etymology of these terms was sought intentionally to be derogated and or hidden, consistent with the confederacy of the enemies of Israel, which is there spoken of at Psalms 83. Where in verse 4 it reads, "They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." Okay, so that NEGA in referencing the tribal root of King David, in its narrow meaning would reference the tribe of Judah, because David obviously was of the tribe of Judah. But in its broader meaning, it's referencing the 12 tribes of Jacob, because Judah was the fourth son of Jacob, and therefore Judah is one of the tribes of Jacob. Okay, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So all those who are of bloodline descent from Jacob / Israel are called Israelites. Okay, all those are also Negro in the original Hebrew meaning of the latter word, because it is referencing those people who are tribally of the same root as NEGA David. So they mean the same thing. So tautologically, which is a fancy, go back to a Greek word, which in logic means that the one thing defines the other thing. Okay, you're just using different words to say the same thing. So there's a tautological sense in which the Negro is Israelite. And in that tautological sense, no further proof is required. You could straight away say, if it were a mathematical proof, it is like a QED, which was to be proved. That Negro means Israelite. Okay, but of course we can't get away with such a simple proof for obvious reasons, because nowadays we think the word Negro not to mean that original meaning, which is there in the original Hebrew understanding or definition that you could tease out of that word. But we take Negro to associate people carrying certain physiognomic characteristics: skin color, which is dark of skin; hair texture, which is, woolly as to hair texture; and then the other various secondary features that one gets to know who's a Negro. Because the other people on the planet were also dark of skin and even woolly of hair. The Hamites, for example, and originally the Ishmaelites, who went on into what became known as the Arab Peninsula. And they originally were people also of dark skin and woolly hair. And they have lightened and sort of whitened over the years for reasons which I address in another chapter of the book, the race and color issue. I address it originally in the book, The Appointed Time, and then again I came back to it with some additional sort of, findings in the second book, The Coming of David, Messiah. So if we take the word Negro to refer to a people called Negro and who are sort of recognized and known by, these sort of incidental physiognomic characteristics, darkness of skin and woolliness of hair, and indeed darkness in only not even necessarily so, because we also know there's some very light-skinned Negroes, Colin Powell being one example. Okay, so the darkness of skin, even that is not a definitive, but when you look at his facial sort of architecture and so forth, then yeah, you could say, well, he's a Negro, Because certainly there are other people that are about the same shade of color as Colin Powell, but you would never make the mistake of calling them Negro. Because there's also the nose, and there's also the lips, and there's also, again, a kind of a facial architecture. Okay, and then there are also even other characteristics that go now to the spirit of the person. A Negro person is generally a person without guile. That's there in Scripture. And even, well, it's not only that there's a broadness of nose that's involved. It's also that kind of, sort of deeper kind of characteristics that we can more or less tell a Negro when we meet one. I live here and was born here in Trinidad. We have Indians, so some Indians are darker of skin than a Negro. But they tend to be straight of hair. But then you also have the mixing that was going on. So you have a mix of Indian and Negro that's called Dogla. And somehow or other, if you attune to these things, you can almost tell that Dogla whose father is Negro versus that Dogla whose father is Indian. Because there's a slight difference in terms of the spirit of the person. Now, okay, some people want to argue that, and I will not get into that because that's a kind of a never-ending argument, and it's very sort of mushy and woolly and not so sharply defined. But I just want to throw out there that in proving Negro Israelite identity from a linguistic kind of perspective and angle, it is a tautology. The word Negro means Israelite. And the word Israelite means Negro in that broader sense. In the narrower sense, the Negro is Judah, as referencing that one of the 12 tribes of Israel from whom King David originated. So the narrow reference is that the Negro is Judah, and because it's a tautology, it's vice versa. Judah is Negro. Okay? But as I said, you can't stop it right there because that would remain profoundly unsatisfying for those that require quote unquote proof. Okay, so let's go now to the proof. If we kind of, don't, insist on the linguistic kind of tautology. If we just back off a minute and say, okay, well, the Negro is merely a certain set of people known to have the characteristics of dark skin and woolly hair. And furthermore, those people who were scattered to the west and also scattered all over the world, not only to the west, and in particular was scattered to the west in these more recent times as part of what is sort of euphemistically called the transatlantic slave trade. To give it the word trade, kind of says, more about it than one ought to sort of concede, but let's go with it. So who are these people that came off the slave ships who were known to those who were in the trade as Negroes, and also they were known to themselves as Negroes because it was their word originally. And we've made the mistake now in thinking because we, having been reduced into servitude, part of what went along with that was a certain disdain, a certain derogation, where the enemy, because we were sold unto our enemies, isn't it? They tried, and they say in Psalms 83, to cut us off from remembrance of who we were. They tried what does it say? To take Israel out of remembrance. You understand? So that the word Negro became a term of derogation. So much so that we have assumed, having now lost that link back to, our earlier history, going back to, in effect, King David and beyond, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves, the patriarchs, having lost that link, we thought that the word Negro was put upon us as being that term of derogation, with an inherently negative aspect to its meaning. And, to give an example of that, we don't have to look very far because we ourselves did it. For example, our brother there, what's his name, that wrote the book From Hebrews to Negroes. Because implicit in that title is the idea that here were Hebrews, and that was noble in terms of identity. And when he says from Hebrews to Negroes, the implication is that we lost that nobility of being Hebrews as to identity and have become reduced to this thing called a Negro, who seemingly has no right to any kind of respect from anybody on the planet. Well, that is true that we don't get respect, because that was one of the curses that was prophesied. But it doesn't mean that the word Negro per se was a term of derogation. Our enemy made it into a term of derogation. That is all, and that's an entirely different matter. Okay, so uh, without sort of first reclaiming the word. Let's say we had not reclaimed the word, as was the case with the first book, The Appointed Time, and we simply go with what is known to be the case, that everybody knows who and what a Negro was. Those of us who brought here to the West in slave ships, or at the very least were reduced to slavery here in the West, because some of us Negroes never came across in the slave boat, but nevertheless were reduced to the same servitude. You understand? Okay. But that's kind of, because you look up the book that they came before Columbus, which would let you know that the Negroes as a people were here in the West long before Columbus came. All right, but that's another subject which I won't go into here on this occasion. I'm trying to keep it brief. That's what I said I would try to do, and I'm probably failing miserably in that regard. But bear with me. So how now do we go about proving this Negro, shorn of that linguistic link back to David and Israel, and therefore Israel? How do you prove that this Negro is Israelite? We have no problem understanding what an Israelite is. An Israelite is one who is of the bloodline, physical bloodline of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is by definition what an Israelite is. And now we want to show that this person that has been reduced in circumstance, because he has been reduced to slavery, isn't he? Now to show that this enslaved person called a Negro indeed is Israelite. How do we prove that? Okay, so this is where I now take up the sort of overview question as to how you prove Negro Israelite identity. We go to scripture, because some people get the matter kind of hopelessly mixed up. There's so many different parts to it. Once one gets into addressing the identity question, there's so many pieces of evidence that it sort of clouds the issue as to what really this as to what really all is going on. Oh Lord. Yeah. So, but what I want to suggest is that the essence of the proof must lie in prophecy. We get sort of tangled up with our own sort of ideas of science if we come about it from any other angle to begin with. We can get to those other angles. Yes, I certainly don't disagree with that. And in particular, we can get to the DNA angle. But what I'm suggesting in terms of the sort of overview of the proof, what I'm suggesting is it is to scripture that we must go and to prophecy. And this indeed is what the Most High intended. We cannot, using population DNA analysis, prove that the Negro is Israelite. I'm sorry, we cannot. Okay? But if we prove using scripture that the Negro of the West is Israelite, and now you do a population DNA analysis of Negro Israelite Y-DNA haplotype, which is what comes from father to son, and we find that overwhelmingly we are E1B1A haplotype. That's just what they call it. Now you can use that fact, because we can now go to Africa and look at the Y-DNA haplotype of those Bantu tribes in Africa, And we can now get a sense of, okay, well, the Negro of the West is related to those Bantu tribes over there because just as we are about 70 or so percent white DNA haplotype E1B1A, the Negro of the West, United States, and of course the Caribbean, and now you go to Africa and you check the white DNA haplotype, population type statistics of, let's say, the Bamileke of the Cameroon, which is a remarkable group because they're in certain samples anyway that they have tested, it was 100% E1B1A. If you go to the Yoruba, it is also very high, but it's not even 100%. If you go to the Lemba down there in Zimbabwe and Zambia and northern South Africa, you might get 50% E1B1A. Okay? But if we prove through prophecy that the Negro of the West is definitely Israelite, then we can also infer using population genetic analysis that the Bamileke of Cameroon are also Israelite. And various other Bantu tribes also, albeit to varying degrees, are also Israelite. That's how the proof goes. Okay, so first prophecy. From prophecy, you draw a conclusion. Then, having drawn that conclusion, we now can apply population DNA analysis, and we can compare certainly with the Bantu tribes of Africa and find that correlation, or even stronger than that, we can find that we're related. Now, population genetics is not that good, not that reliable. It's got limitations to it. Why? Because as we transmit that DNA, protein, whatever it is, Y-DNA, from father to son, there's always a chance, a sort of a random chance of a genetic mutation. So from generation to generation, there's a chance that Y-DNA will not necessarily be passed on unchanged. And if we have, if we want to say go back to the source, to Jacob himself, and perhaps even the 12 patriarchs, 12 sons of Jacob, first of all, we don't have reference samples to go by. But even if we had reference samples to go by, we still could not expect, given the possibility and indeed likelihood, that there would be these genetic mutations going from generation to generation, so that after a long enough chain of generations, we could not any longer expect that what you would get from the reference sample 150 generations or 200 generations later is going to be exactly the same. So that if I say that we have Israelite brethren scattered to the far South Pacific, for example, the people of Fiji, original people, the people of Hawaii, and so forth, but then you do your genetic analysis and you're not getting E1B1A. Well, there's a certain arbitrariness of classification, number one, in what is called the phylogenetic classification tree that puts different peoples in different sort of, Y-DNA classifications. But because of the sort of generational distance, if we go back up, because people of Fiji would have scattered down to the South Pacific around 720 or so BC, if we go according to Scripture. 2nd Ezra chapter 13, verses 40 to 45, where the northern tribes were scattered out into lands where never before mankind dwelt. That's 722 BC. That's the closest 3,000 years ago. Okay, is how far away in time and therefore in generations the Fijians are to us, as compared with the slave trade, which would have started in earnest only around the 1650s or so. It was only about 400 or 500 years ago. So that we're not that far separated in time or in number of generations from our Bantu brethren in Africa. And so we here in the West would still have the same E1, B1A classification in large degree as compared with the classification of the Bantu in Africa. But the Fijians would not be classified in the same way. But we couldn't conclude from that the Fijians therefore are not Israelites. No, sir. And that's why population DNA analysis gets a little bit indeed confusing if we now try to use it for purposes of defining identity. Okay, all right. So let's go now to the prophetic angle for purposes of determining um, the proof of identity. Because this is where the Most High says, look, he's going to put curses upon us. Let's go down to Deuteronomy chapter 20. The first 14 verses are the blessings, if we would be obedient. And then in verse 15 it says, but it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of Yahweh your Eloah, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. All of these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Not some of these curses, all of them. So that if we go by prophecy, the curses now start in verse 16 and carry on all the way down to verse 68. So whoever are the real Israelites, on the assumption that we disobeyed or they disobeyed the law of God, they would be exhibiting all the curses from verse 16 to 68. And if some of these curses do not apply to such a candidate people, then it's not a match. So all these curses have to apply. And we see that more or less explicitly stated here in verses 45 and 46. Verse 45, moreover, all these curses shall. Earlier it said will, but here it says shall. So there's no escaping it. Shall come upon you and pursue and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh your Eloah to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. And here is a key verse here, verse 46. And they shall be upon you for a sign and a wonder, and on your descendants forever, for a sign and a wonder. So in other words, if the curses do not apply to a people, then that's how you know that they are not Israelites. Okay. Well, the first assertion I would make and have made in that first book, The Appointed Time, I didn't go down the entire list of 53 curses from 16 to 68, verses 16 to 68. But when one does the sort of detailed analysis, as our brothers in the various camps have done a very good job of that, we indeed find that the Negro is a match to every last one of them. Not some of them, all of them. And if it is a matter that you have a question about, it would only be because your knowledge of history is insufficient for it to become clearly evident. But once you know the required history, then it will become very evident that all of these curses, not some of them, all of these curses indeed have come upon and applied to those people we know as being Negroes and came off the slave ships and were known as Negroes by everybody else and also known to themselves as Negroes. Okay, so here we must also do something else. Not only must we include the Negro as being a fit to all of these curses, we must also show that it does not, these curses do not all apply to any other people. And that uniqueness is implicit, well, not implicit, it is as a matter of empirical fact present there in verse 68, this particular curse. And Yehovah will take you back to Egypt in ships, Egypt, meaning bondage, for this purpose, by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again, and there you shall be. I'm looking at NKJV, I need to look at the KJV because it is saying that we would be the NKJV because they changed it. It is saying that we would be offered for sale where yes, where the original King James said something different. Where it says, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Well, this applies to the Negro, obviously, because we were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. We came in ships, in the slave ships. And certainly after we came off the ships, we were sold, were we not? And we were not sold unto our friends. We were sold unto our enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Now that and here this has been a cause of some confusion among some of our people, but how it is resolved is very simple. If we have been sold, that means we have been bought. There cannot be a selling of something unless somebody else is doing a buying of that same thing. Selling and buying go hand in hand. Okay, there's a seller on one side and a buyer on the other side. So if we are sold unto our enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, where it says, and no man shall buy you, that second word buy must be buy in a different sense from, the buying that goes along as the counterpart of selling. You understand? And indeed, all that is redeemed, which we see here in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. I think it's verse 48. Start at verse 47, where it says, and if a sojourner or stranger wax rich by thee, and thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell himself unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family. Verse 48, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. So this is the idea of the kinsman redeemer. Well, if you are redeemed out of a bondage, then in effect, your bondage contract is being bought out again. That's what redeem means. So redeem, the word redeem also, in a sense, means buy. You understand? And so this is the reference there in Deuteronomy 28:68 as to the different meaning of the word buy. And I address that specifically in the appointed time, that first book. Here we go. And here I went through some of the curses, but not all of them. And in the case of Deuteronomy 28:68, it's there treated in subsection 9 of that big paragraph, to be returned into captivity in ships and sold for slaves unto our enemy into a new form of chattel slavery, from which we could not be redeemed, because the kinsman redeemer under Israelite law could always have redeemed a brethren of one who went into slavery voluntarily, because it was usually voluntary, because if you got down on your luck, you basically sell yourself into slavery or sell yourself into bondage or into an employment contract. If you're an employee to some boss or to some company, you are in a kind of a bondage. That's what employment really means. Okay? Anyway, so here I explicitly spell it out in verse 28:68. And Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy, i.e., redeem you. And in parentheses, that is explained. The Hebrew word used here for buy is kana, Strong's H7069, one sense of which is given as redeem. And that sense of redeem has two aspects to it. One is to get, acquire, create, buy, possess, and then the second is to get, acquire, obtain, and in particular, A, of God originating, creating, or redeeming his people. Okay. So this sense of redeem has to be what is meant in this context, since earlier in the verse it says, shall be sold, hence also bought. So under Israelite law, a bond servant could be redeemed from bondage. This verse is therefore saying that the bondage to which we would be reduced would be one from which that option was not available. So it was describing chattel slavery. And it is saying it would be entered via ships. So the transatlantic slave trade is therefore a fit. Okay, so and is there another candidate as a people who are a fit to this prophecy? No, because this hasn't happened to anybody else. All the slaves that came off those slave boats were Negro people. dark of skin and woolly of hair. You understand? There might have been, some Edomites that came in the mix. I think there's a story told of one Edomite who indeed was the son of a chieftain of some sort, but he was returned. I've forgotten his name. That story I have written about someplace else, but I forget now where. So I won't go look for it. But the other aspect of this is not only are we a unique fit to this particular prophecy, there are other prophecies amongst these 53 verses from verse 16 to 68 where we know that the so-called Jews are simply not a fit. So not only are they, can we dismiss them from candidacy for being Israelites because they are not a fit to verse 68, because they have not gone into bondage anywhere as slaves. And excuse me, I mean, yes, they've suffered persecution here and there and everywhere. Yes, they've been subject to what they call pogroms, which is just a different word for persecution. People have come against them and burnt their houses and so forth. But never were they reduced to slavery. So they are not a fit, because it must be all these curses must come upon whoever are a candidate people. But in addition to that, there's some other verses where they're simply not a fit. And I'll go to them. Item number 7 here. It says one of the curses would be to become always the tail, never the head, ever the borrower, never the lender, which is there in verse 44 of Deuteronomy chapter 28. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Well, the so-called Jews are indeed lenders to the world. They're the bankers to the world. They're the ones that own the Federal Reserve System of the United States. They're the ones that own the various central banks around the world. So they are the ones that control international finance. They're the ones that even determine the price of gold at the London Metal Exchange. Under market pressure, of course. But they sit as a committee and they set the price of gold every day. London Metal Exchange, look it up. So this rules them out. The true children of Israel shall be lent to. We would not be the ones doing the lending. And also he shall be the head and thou shalt be the tail. So they're not the tail, they're the head. They're the ones that essentially own the Federal Reserve and etc. And then item 8, to see the stranger in our midst rise up high above us. Deuteronomy 28 and 43. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. Well, quite the opposite. The so-called Jews, wherever they have gone, have risen up very high. They have become the lawyers, they become the doctors, and they become the money lenders and bankers. And also the owners, in terms of the capitalist system and etc. They're the ones that basically control the flow of money through finance. So they get up high above everybody else wherever they have gone. That was what Hitler was railing about. Okay, they were basically overlords there in Germany. They became overlords there and still are in Britain. They became overlords in the United States and still are to this day. They're the ones that essentially they control American foreign policy, whoever be the president. In the guise of what's also called the neocons and etc., they're all overwhelmingly of that same persuasion. So that's how you know that the so-called Jews are not the true Israelites of the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were not brought down into slavery. They have become high over every other people wherever they've been scattered, although, yes, they have suffered persecution and so forth. And in part because they have risen high. So that attracts envy, it attracts jealousy, it attracts resentment, especially when some of their practices to become high above are not all that honorable. And money lenders are sort of always resented. Okay, so that rules out the so-called being a candidate, and ain't no other candidate for the slavery curse. As a people, there's no other people that would reduce into servitude in the same way. Yes, you've had all kinds of people who became indentured servants, but not straight up chattel slaves. Right here in Trinidad, after the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, and they needed workers to keep working the plantations, they brought in Indians from India under indentureship contracts, but they were paid in coin and paid also in land. And they had the option after whatever, 5 years or 7 years, I forget the terms of I think it varied actually. They could go back home to India with their earnings. That wasn't slavery without any kind of pay. You understand? So there is no other candidate. All right. So once now having proven the matter through scripture, now we can go and look at other kinds of proofs and evidences, including the DNA kind of proof and evidence, as I have already kind of tried to outline. But in addition to that, there's also the archaeological kind of proof, which is very persuasive. Yes, archaeological proof, because there were various, stone carvings that were made at this point of Israelite history. And when we go look at those stone carvings, what we find is that here's one of them. It's a stone carving made of Israelite musicians in captivity there in Babylon. And you can see they've got the sort of the hair braided into cornrows. They were certainly known to be musicians even back in the day, as attested to in Psalm 137. How does it go? By the rivers of Babylon, where we wept. Somebody asked us to sing a song of Israel. I'll go to that in a minute. But here we are, and so you could see if you look at these faces, they are that typical Negro face. It's a little bit too fuzzy in this rendition here. Um, and there we were actually in the Middle Ages because we were ruling in Western Europe for a while until under that genocidal war of Albion versus Niger, Negro rule there was brought down. And so there's another picture I want to. I think that one was in chapter 4. Yeah, here are two more. Oh, you see that one already. This one is taken from, I think this one was called the Siege of Lachish. I may be mistaken as to that, but there again you see the Negro woolly hair, the Negro features. And this one we have seen men of Judah in Babylonian captivity. Okay, well, so much for that. Okay, but the point of the archaeological evidence then tending to, because we know what the Negro looks like. If we go by a definition, not the tautological definition that the Negro is Israelite, but rather the definition where we assign to the Negro identity based on physiological characteristics, dark skin, woolly hair, and etc. Well, the archaeological reliefs that have come down, and they're there in the British Museum, show that we, the Negro, look like the people depicted in those archaeological reliefs. So that's the archaeological physiognomic kind of proof. And then there's not only the linguistic proof that derives specifically from the word Negro, but also there's other kinds of linguistic proofs. Because in chapter 3 of this book, I was given to give um, rectifications of the various names of all the various prophets. Okay? And one of the things that comes out of that is also that when we look at Bantu names, we can see, because the Bantu languages are daughter languages of paleo-Hebrew, we see that, wait a minute, although anglicized, you can still make out that a lot of these Bantu names are Israelite names that we now recognize, but in their anglicized form, because we now know them as English. All the names of the prophets, all the names of the apostles and so forth, Matthew, Mark, Luke, not Luke, but certainly Matthew, that is an Israelite name, Mateha, and it means a rod. So it's a referencing the whole sort of, all the tribes of Jacob. So it's both the meaning of literal rod, piece of wood, a stick, and also the idea of the sort of collective that are the 12 tribes, because we talk about stems coming out of rods. You understand? And rods coming out of branches and so forth. So Mateha is one. Even my own name, Thomas, which is an anglicized form of a Hebrew name, Tumuhu, really. And when it comes through the Greek, in the Greek it was in Greek form rendered as something like Tamas, Tamas, and then it sort of came into English as Thomas. And then I think I made reference to a Nigerian external affairs minister who I did not know him personally, but an item came in the news where certain Nigerian diplomats had been sort of roughed up by the authorities in Indonesia for some whatever good or otherwise, but not so good reason, most likely. And so Nigerian authorities, the external affairs minister, had to register a protest. Well, okay, when that name was reported in the papers, his name was Onyeama. Onyeama. And once you get into the paleo-Hebrew, you recognize that name straight away. The Onye prefix is a way of saying Iye. And the Ama suffix, okay, is letting you know it is Iye Amo. Iye Amo is what has come into the English as James. You understand? So a lot of the names they're still in the Bantu languages, but unless you're sensitive to language, you're not going to recognize them as being Paleo-Hebrew names. And there are many of them. Yakubu, they still use Yakub, a lot of them, which is Jacob. Um, I can't. I'm drawing a blank as to other examples. But again, I've come across a few along the way of doing this kind of work. There's that kind of evidence, and there's also all kinds of other cultural evidence. As a matter of fact, there are even some words that are unique to the Bantu people. Let me see if I can find any. There's a word ba'ana, which basically means the children. Literally, it's the house of the sons. So it would be ba, or from the Hebrew letter bait, depicted as a house, and then nun, which is the seed or continuation or son, depicted indeed as a sort of a seed. So ba'ana is uniquely there we go. Ba'ana, the son of Ahilud, is uniquely a Bantu word. It's not there in any other language. If one can disprove me, I'd like to know. But the word Ba'ana, the name Ba'ana, and the word or name, because it's usually as a name as well. It's not there in any other language on the earth. Okay, and there are all kinds of other cultural evidences that are there once you go into the Bible. I mentioned that I was initiated as a priest of Ifa, and this was before I had anything more than casual acquaintance with the Bible. But afterwards, when I got into the Bible, And I went into Exodus chapter, whatever chapter it was, where Moses, that chapter where Moses initiated Aaron and his sons into the Aaronic priesthood. When I read, what was done for that initiation, I recognized that most of what was being described there is what I went through as part of my initiation as a priest of Ifa in the Yoruba tradition, and all kinds of other kinds of cultural, practices that one recognizes in Scripture as still being practiced and present amongst the Bantu peoples there in Africa. But let me also, so in other words, we have proof positive, just as a matter of tautology, that the very word Negro means Israelite. That's number one. Number two, proof positive as to the curses that were put upon the children of Israel to be a sign and a wonder, specifically so that in the end he could re-identify himself. All those curses that were put upon Israel, the Negro as a people are a match to all of those, okay? And uniquely so, because at least one of those prophecies, no other people are a match, which is this transatlantic slave trade. Okay, and those people who claim to be Jews are not a match to that prophecy, certainly, because they didn't go into slavery anywhere, and they are not a match to two or three other prophecies, which call for the Negro to be beneath everybody else. Even the stranger in our midst would rise high above us. But contrariwise, the so-called Jews, wherever they've gone, they have risen high above the indigenous people. And that is what has attracted resentment and has led to persecution and pogroms and expulsion. But none of that amounts to slavery. None of that amounts to servitude, affliction through servitude. And also the one where it says, the children of Israel would be always the borrower, never the lender. Well, that definitely rules out the so-called Jews, because everywhere they've gone, they've been the lender. And they've become the head, not the tail. Contrary to that verse 44, which says that everywhere we would be scattered effectively, we would become the tail, not the head. So they are spectacular failure to fulfill those prophecies. And in failing to fulfill any one of those prophecies, you get ruled out. So it cannot be the so-called Jews. It's the Negro. So this is how, in a sort of a nutshell, I would advance a proof of Negro Israelite identity. But there are all kinds of other incidental kind of indications when you read scripture, when you realize, for example, that for example, when Herod was going to kill all the children 2 years old and under, trying to get into the dragnet, trying to get the baby Jesus, so to say, in that way. And Joseph was given a dream and told to go down into Egypt and hide from Herod. Well, it's a logical thing. If Jesus was white, he couldn't go and hide in black Egypt. He would stand out like a sore thumb, you understand? And then when you read that Paul, was mistaken for an Egyptian, and when you read that Moses, when he ran away from Egypt and got into the land of Midian, and the daughters there of Midian went back home and they said they encountered this Egyptian fellow that helped them, draw water from the well and to water the sheep, I think it was. So obviously Moses was like an Egyptian, and the Egyptians were known to be dark of skin and woolly of hair. So there are all kinds of other subsidiary and secondary kinds of indications which only help to cement conclusion already reached logically out of prophecy, and then furthermore added to out of DNA kind of analysis and etc. Okay, so there's much more than one can say as to this, but that is all that I want to say. And so I will end this particular talk with that, giving all praise, giving all glory, giving all thanks, giving all exaltation unto the Most High. And to those of you still listening, I say Shalom.